So the common story goes that the Great Recession was caused by unfettered capitalism, right? The free market is always to blame. It was greedy businessmen. And then the government came in to save the day. Well, this economist has an alternative hypothesis. Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader, and today I'm reviewing The Housing Boom and Bust, written by Thomas Sowell in 2009. And this is a book that talks about what caused the Great Recession of 2008. And Thomas Sowell's thesis here is that no, it was not the excesses of free market capitalism that caused the housing boom and bust or the Great Recession. In actuality, it was a bunch of government interventions that accumulated over several decades and eventually led to the housing bust. So there are several aspects to this financial crisis, and Thomas Sowell goes through each of them in this book, The Housing Boom and Bust. So long-term cause number one. Back in the 1970s, the local governments in the United States, so in different counties in California, for example, started placing large housing building restrictions. So these things are known as smart growth laws or zoning laws or protecting farmland laws or things like that. And what these prohibitions basically did is that they limited the amount of land that housing could be built on. There were several different housing restrictions. So for example, it might say, no, you're not allowed to build a 20-story housing block, you have to build it 10 stories max. So that takes up more land, but in the same time you're restricting the use of land, so you're making land more scarce. And in economics, what happens when something is more scarce? It goes up in price. So because of this, starting in the 1970s, you had a large rise in the cost of housing in several counties in the United States, such as in the LA area, in New York, in San Francisco, in Las Vegas, in Tucson. And of course, when you take out a mortgage on housing, you have to take out interest on that. But when housing becomes more expensive, one interest point can be the difference between thousands of dollars in monthly payments. This was one of the causes of creative financing, where people seek to take out loans, for example, where you have no down payment, so that's known as an interest-only loan, or where you have an adjustable interest rate, so where the interest rate is based on how the market is going, so it may be low initially, then it may rise, or you may have something called a teaser interest rate, where in the first few months you have a very low interest rate, and only afterwards do you actually start paying down the mortgage and the interest rate rises. Underlying cause number two of the housing boom and bust was the Community Reinvestment Act, and it being expanded and expanded and expanded. So this was originally passed under the Carter administration, but under the Bushes and Clinton it was heavily expanded. So this basically put pressure on banks and on government-sponsored enterprises such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to follow the goal of affordable housing in politics. This means issuing more loans to low-income people or minorities to make the statistics look more equal. Now, in a normal free market economy, whether you get the chance to take out a loan to pay down a mortgage, that depends on your credit worthiness. So that includes factors like having a high income or reliably paying back your debts. And the more factors you have in your favor, the higher the chance you're gonna get a loan and the lower the interest rate is gonna be. Now, of course, the people that governments wanted to become homeowners had lower credit ratings, so normally they would pay higher interest rates or they would not be given the loans, but they can't really afford that. So government pressured these enterprises to do some creative financing to give these people mortgages. And you had two special firms in the economy known as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and these were so-called private enterprises, but they were government backed, and they basically bought mortgages, and the government put pressure on them to buy more and more subprime mortgages. And of course, when assessing risk, if that risk is taken over by someone else, such as the government or a government-backed enterprise, then you're more willing to take more risk, as more risk usually means higher profits. And if all things go bad, you can await a bailout. And this led to the growing of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae to having over $1 trillion in mortgage investments, securities, and things like that. And you had different banks and groups buying these mortgage securities, which looked okay, and that was because you had these oligopolistic credit rating agencies. Now these credit rating agencies, and there were three of them, such as I think Moody's and Standard & Poor and Finch, they had experience with 30-year fixed rate mortgages and down payment mortgages, but they did not have all this experience with this creative financing mortgages, because they had no competition, they gave very optimistic ratings, which of course misled people to buy these mortgage securities that had been bundled together. And this is in no way free market. Sure, it was private enterprises maybe, but it was limited competition by the government. And of course, during all this time, you have politicians like Bernie Frank who are putting pressure on enterprises to issue more and more loans, to have more and more poor people or minorities to become house owners. But of course, these people were credit risks who had more foreclosures than an average person, who were more delinquent in their payments, so that meant that they were late with paying their mortgage down. But you had prices rising, and you had refinancing and things like that, so people were making a bunch of profits, and you had this growing bubble. But eventually people realized these were not good investments. Then you had prices starting to decline, you had more foreclosures, you had people who had taken out more loans based on the equity of their house because their house is going up in price, so they can borrow more money. But when money declines, you can no longer afford to make the payments on the debt you borrowed. You had a bunch of people go bankrupt, and you had a bunch of people who went bankrupt and declared bankruptcy because they realized, okay, government is gonna pay for this anyway, so it's not in my interest to pay back this loan. I'd lose more money than just declaring bankruptcy. Because what was left to pay of the mortgage was often more than the equity they had on their house. So then you have the Great Recession, an economic downturn, starting with declining house prices in 2006. And after this, you have politicians bringing in these banking executives and raking them over the coals in front of Congress, basically saying, why did you do this bad thing and that bad thing? But in reality, the same politicians who were condemning free market capitalism, they were in fact the ones who instigated this Great Recession by putting pressure on enterprises to make risky loans. And also this vision of government intervention was the same thing that caused the rising housing prices, since they would probably favor housing building restrictions. So if you agree with Chicago economist Thomas Sowell interpretation of the Great Recession and the housing boom and bust, you come to the conclusion that it was mainly a bunch of government interventions that caused this Great Recession. And subsequently you had stimulus packages, so-called, passed by Bush and Obama, about similar sizes. But these actually did not stimulate the economy. After they were passed, unemployment kept rising and business investment kept decreasing. So they were supposed to stimulate the economy, but they didn't. And Sowell explains some of the cynicism of the politicians here, who, although what they did not make economic sense, it made political sense, as what they're doing is safeguarding their careers, as they were blaming the businessmen, and also increasing government powers, because you never let a good crisis go to waste, as a famous Democrat said. And one important point of this is that none of this occurred in a free market, because in this Great Recession, even though all of this government-induced disaster was occurring, the market actually reacted itself quite quickly to the reality of the situation. This, for example, led to banks who had seized the foreclosed houses to sell them off at knockoff prices as quick as possible, because they accepted the reality of the situation. But what politicians instead just did was provide a government solution to a problem that was caused by a previous government solution. Of course, this government solution will have consequences down the line, as we may be seeing soon in the American economy today, or as we may have already seen actually. So that's the housing boom and bust by Thomas Sowell. So how would I rate it? I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10. I don't always agree with Thomas Sowell's economic analysis completely, as he's a Chicago economist. I consider myself more part of the Austrian School of Economics, but there's nothing I disagree with really in this book. He explains succinctly in this book what were the causes of the housing boom and bust, the Great Recession. And sure, private actors had some responsibility for this, but it was in the context of a government-created situation, not in the free market at all. One interesting contrast to what's described in this book in America is Canada, who, although they had a recession, did not have the same housing bubble, because the banking system there is not based or focused on affordable housing, but instead on maintaining risk, which is a much more sensible economic policy. So if you want a good explanation of the Great Recession, I definitely recommend you to read The Housing Boom and Bust by Thomas Sowell. And when you read this book, you understand this is not a crisis that was brought about by capitalism itself, but instead by government corrupting it. But of course, you readers may have a different point of view of what caused the Great Recession, so you can post in the comments down below, what do you believe did cause the Great Recession? Do you agree with Thomas Sowell that it was a bunch of government interventions mainly? Or do you believe that it was caused by capitalism? Or maybe something else? And if you like this Thomas Sowell book review, I have also a playlist here of other Thomas Sowell's book reviews that you can check out. Anyways, I'm the avid reader, and I will see you readers next time.